Please welcome the president of Stony Brook University, Maurie McInnis.
Good evening, everyone. Glad to have you with us for Stony Brook's second in our special series on climate change. We are thrilled to host our esteemed guest, Kim Stanley Robinson, one of the country's most celebrated authors and innovative thinkers on the future of our climate. He is joining us remotely this afternoon to explore with us how the climate crisis is impacting our world and the steps that humanity can take to mitigate this. Last April, as many of you are aware, the City of New York and the Trust for Governors Island selected the New York Climate Exchange, a historic partnership led by Stony Brook University and a valuable team of partner organizations to create a climate science solutions center on Governors Island. Our goal is to develop innovative, equitable climate solutions that can be brought to market, scaled, and applied globally. The exchange builds on Stony Brook's strength as one of the nation's premier research universities with a rich legacy in the fields of inquiry most relevant to building climate solutions. And so having Stan with us today to hear his perspectives on the complex and ever so necessary work of responding to the climate crisis is truly an honor. Stan, not only are so many of us avid fans, your work speaks to us as a university as we unite creativity with scientific thinking and respond to the urgent need for effective, thoughtful solutions to climate change. Thank you for speaking with us today. So let me say a few words about our speaker. Kim Stanley Robinson is an American science fiction writer and author of more than 20 books, including the international best-selling Mars trilogy, and more recently, New York, 2140, something we should all read, Aurora, Shaman, and Green Earth. Stan's novel, The Ministry for the Future, was selected as one of Barack Obama's favorite books of 2020, one of Bill Gates' 5 great books for the summer of 22. While discussing Robinson's writing on the New York Times podcast, Ezra Klein said, "Geology is a character and a context in his work, whether that is the terrain of Mars, the coastal structure of New York, or the glittery mountains of California." So it is both fitting and exciting that Robinson's latest book, The High Sierra, a love story, breaks the mold as his first major work of nonfiction and is a thoughtful exploration of Robinson's years spent hiking and camping in the Sierra Nevada mountains. Please join me in welcoming Kim Stanley, or Stan Robinson, to begin our conversation, which will be followed by a Q&A session. Over to Stan.
Thank you, President McInnis, for that kind introduction. I'm hoping you all can hear me. And my apologies for the virtual appearance as opposed to in person. I'd like to have been there, but I know you all understand also. So as Maurie explained to you, I'll speak for about 25 minutes and then invite her back onto stage and we'll have a conversation with her and with all of you. And I've been asked to talk about the climate situation. Not an unusual phenomenon these days for me. And I want to give you essentially the latest, the stuff that I've learned in the last 3 years since the Ministry for the Future came out, because it's been quite an education. And I've been thinking now that one way to conceptualize our time in this century is that we are in a carbon overshoot. And what I mean by that, and I use the word overshoot because people used to use this term about 30 years ago talking about population, that was inappropriate, I think. However many people there are on the planet is the right number that we have to deal with. And so that was always an awkward way to try to talk about the Earth's problems. Better application here is a carbon overshoot. There is too much CO2 in the atmosphere. There will be for decades. We are at, say, 415 to 420 parts per million. That we're going to have to draw down enough CO2 to get back to around 350 parts per million. The historical record, the paleo record, is extremely clear on this. It's seldom been true. Well, the CO2 level in the atmosphere over geological time has truly been all over the map, and sometimes over 1,000 parts per million. But in the last million or 2 years, it has fluctuated very regularly between about 280 parts per million and about 350. And the last time it was over 400, there was no ice on the planet. And you all right there are about 90 feet above sea level. And if all the ice on the planet were melted, sea level would be 270 feet higher. Long Island, as you know, is just a big glacial moraine from the ice cap of the previous ice age. And that shows you how big that ice cap was. But in any case, we can't let that happen. It will be very important to draw down carbon from the atmosphere. That will be part of the project, and it will take decades. It will take industrial level efforts and a lot of manipulation of the natural world. So in those decades where we have too much CO2 in the atmosphere by billions of tons, we are in danger of that of creating that so-called hothouse Earth that we see in the geological past. At certain times in the past when things were very much warmer than now, and yet there was about the same amount of CO2 in the atmosphere as now. We have made that rapid, much more rapid than natural processes of geology. The human release of CO2 to the atmosphere since the Industrial Revolution, very much of it in the last 30 years as part of the Great Acceleration, is really new in geological history. This has never happened before. We don't know what's going to happen. We do know that it's dangerous and unstable. And Johann Rockstrom at the Potsdam Institute, he needs to be attended to as he speaks about planetary boundaries. And it isn't just carbon dioxide. There are other planetary boundaries that we are breaking through as a civilization that will destabilize the Earth system. So we're in really serious danger that needs to be emphasized. And Kirk Johnson, the head of paleontology at the Smithsonian Institute, he recently cooperated with ANOVA, the PBS program up in Boston, to make a show called Arctic Extremes. And I just saw it recently. He's very, very good, like Rockstrom, in conveying this danger to the public. And in this case, in an extremely calm, friendly, non-media savvy, but ultimately charming way that if we, in what we're doing right now, if we carelessly and inattentively heat up the planet enough to release the carbon and the methane that is currently frozen in the Arctic tundra, then that's about 3 to 4 times the amount of CO2 that's in the atmosphere already. And at that point, we really are in an ice-free hothouse Earth. And so we're trembling on the brink. And so the situation is quite serious. So we will be, I believe we are gathering forces as a civilization to begin to draw down carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And while that is happening, you can use an analogy that the Earth is like a person. They have a fever. The fever itself might kill them. We need to reduce the fever while we solve the underlying health problems that cause the fever. And so, in short, there is already a really powerful discussion about should we make interventions in the climate system to cool the planet down while we are decarbonizing. Sometimes that gets called geoengineering. The name has already been disabled as a term. It sounds like something bad. It sounds hubristic to engineer the geological system. We're not that powerful. We're not that smart. And so the term geoengineering really means bad things that we might try to do to make up for the bad things that we did before. It creates a knee-jerk reaction across a broad swath of the public, including my particular audience, which I would say is environmentalists, Greens, leftists. That community in particular has a knee-jerk reaction against geoengineering as a trick of the fossil fuel industries. Well, that's wrong. That needs to be rethought across the board. And so taking the name off of it is one of the first steps in this ideological or public relations battle to get people to realize that we might have to do some previously radical or unthinkable things to keep the planet cool whilst we decarbonize the atmosphere. So it's decades long that we may be involved in this, and we certainly have to discuss all the methods. The most famous one is called solar radiation management, to toss dust or sulfur dioxide into the high stratosphere and deflect a couple percentage points of sunlight away from Earth before it hits Earth at all, by increasing the high albedo. That would lower the temperature of the Earth by a degree or two for the time in which we continue to keep the dust or sulfur dioxide up there. This sounds crazy and hubristic and dangerous, and all that might be true. And yet, of all of the methods being proposed, that one is the simplest, the least expensive, the most logistically possible for humans to achieve, and maybe the most effective in lowering the temperature. It needs to be discussed. It is already being discussed, but there's a kind of a shocked disinclination to consider anything so radical. Having messed up the Earth system, do we really want to do something that might mess it up even more? And also the moral hazard. If we have a tool like that on hand, does that keep us from rapid decarbonization? Does it give the fossil fuel industries an out? I want to say that the moral hazard argument was maybe valid in 1990, and now we're in an emergency. A full 34 years later, the moral hazard argument isn't relevant. We might need to do things, and they aren't to excuse the fossil fuel industry. They're to keep people from dying in extreme humidity heat events. The human body cannot sustain a wet bulb temperature, wet bulb 35, which is a combination of heat and humidity. High heat with high humidity, the human body cannot survive. It dies of hyperthermia within hours, unless there's electricity. Once the electricity system goes off or shuts down, if the grid fails, people in that temperature only have hours to live. And you can be indoors in the shade, even with a fan on you. None of that will work in extreme heat and humidity combinations. So again, the situation is severe. Now, there are other climate intervention methods that are much less radical in that they are more modular, localized, reversible, and don't seem to have any obvious downsides, like changing the weather patterns or killing off the monsoon. The things that people worry about with solar radiation management are not applicable to tossing some iron filings or artificially created whale poop into certain eddies in the ocean to create algal blooms that then sink to the bottom and take their carbon with them. That's modular, reversible, etc. I'm involved with groups of glaciologists who are contemplating, can we slow down the big glaciers of Antarctica and try to give ourselves some time there while we decarbonize the atmosphere? The method that I've been studying the most is proposed by a group of glaciologists who would like to do experiments and pilot studies to see if it'll work. These glaciers are moving on a layer of water. So they're on a water slide rather than bumping along frozen to the bottom. It might be, there are big ice streams in Antarctica that were moving several hundred meters per year that came to a dead stop because the water coursing underneath it got shifted away into some other stream bed. And when that ice slumped back down onto the rock, it stopped. Um, it's indeed huge in scale and hubristic to think about doing anything to the giant glaciers of Antarctica or the ice sheet. The ice sheet is 10,000 feet tall. It's as big as the continental United States and throw in Mexico. And when you're on it, the idea that you can do anything to it seems unlikely at best. And yet, ice streams have stopped because the water underneath them went away. We might be able to pump that water out. This is the one that I find very interesting because sea level matters. I mean, there you are at 90 feet. I talked about 270 feet. That's an extreme situation that would take, even at the worst, it would take thousands of years. On that Nova show, a scientist said, it's as if you have frozen lasagna in your freezer and the electricity goes off and you open up the doors, the whole house heats instantly. That cake of lasagna stays frozen for quite some time. It's going to melt, but it takes a while. That's the Antarctic ice sheet. Slower, but inevitably, when it melts, it doesn't have to be the full 270 feet of sea level rise to devastate civilization. Even 10 meters, which is quite possible between the Thwaite glaciers and Greenland, even 10 meters rise in sea level, quite possible even in this century, would devastate human civilization in ways we might not be able to recover from. So think about climate interventions as we go forward. And indeed, if ever anyone says to you, well, even sucking CO2 out of the atmosphere is some kind of climate intervention, that has to immediately be countered by the notion we put the CO2 up there. It is like waste. It's a waste stream. It would be like not having a sewage system in your cities. If your cities were completely filled with our excrement and all of our refuge, we would be in dire trouble, and we would build that wastewater system, that waste system, to clean it up. A sewage system for the atmosphere is what CO2 removal is. It has nothing to do really with the kind of climate interventions that are proposed and sometimes put under this rubric of geoengineering. We have to bring CO2 down. Luckily, natural means are very, very powerful for this. Reforesting, foresting in the first place areas that weren't forested before, kelp beds, regenerative agriculture. We can use biology intelligently to draw down a lot of CO2 for the atmosphere. It does not have to be these gigantic vacuum cleaners like perhaps you read about in the New York Times just this morning in Iceland, gigantic machines like vacuum cleaners sucking air through, sucking out the carbon dioxide and pumping it down under the ground. That's not bad. And yet it is radically insufficient to the task and expensive. And indeed, you have to build all these machines, which is carbon intensive itself. The natural methods are probably better, and yet it's not worth scoffing at these machineries that are being built, because they can maybe put that CO2 to use in construction or even for fuel itself, or they can inject it deep underground where it won't get burned up in a forest fire and put back up in the atmosphere, which can happen to forests. So I think that this is a rapid description of the current situation as I see it, the important points in our climate crisis. Some people call it the polycrisis because you should include pandemic diseases, political distress, the other problems that our society is facing right now, rapid improvement of AI. If that isn't a hype, which I suspect that it is, for sure it is a black box of problems that we don't understand fully right now. And in general, the discrepancy between our political economic system, the nation state system politically, global neoliberal capitalism economically, these are very poorly designed for dealing with a global climate problem. So calling it a polycrisis is not inappropriate. And I really have only described to you the specifically climate aspect of it. One last point I want to make on that before I turn to means and ends. The International Maritime Organization declared that container ships needed to clean up their fuel. They use the dirtiest, bunker fuel is the dirtiest diesel, and amazingly CO2 pumped up into the atmosphere along with sulfur. But in any case, the IMO required container ship fuel to be cleaned up. And that took aerosols out of the atmosphere and the temperature shot up. This is precisely a kind of reverse geoengineering that we did. We cleaned up the air, which we needed to do. It's a health issue, and things heated up. And that's why 2023 was one of the hottest year ever recorded by human beings. That shows how tangled things are. Some of the things that we do are going to be good things in themselves and yet redouble our problems in other areas. So it is not going to be a realm of simple solutions. There isn't going to be just a single technological silver bullet or even a few big methods. It's going to be a whole mangle of methods, sometimes conflicting against each other going forward. So a logistical problem in that a lot of these efforts to try to cool ourselves down through the hot years, the carbon overshoot, they would require the equivalent of the US Navy. Essentially the militaries of the world would have to regard national defense as defending also the ecology of the natural world as being part of the nation state. It's a good move, actually. It's not unlikely that the Swiss military spends most of its work doing landslide relief for Switzerland. And an equivalent thing might be in training the militaries of the world to finally become useful for something other than our own particular conflicts with each other. They need to be entrained into the effort. For instance, when Lahaina was burned down recently, the US Navy was just an hour's helicopter ride away in Oahu. And even though it was windy as hell, I've seen helicopters operate in winds of 70 miles an hour in Antarctica. It is not uncommon. The helicopter pilots are skilled and fearless. And the US Navy could have been hugely helped there. It wasn't in their planning. It wasn't a contingency plan that could be activated. It would have had to be improvised on the spot within an hour. No big organization can really do that. So planning becomes important. Logistics, and then that leads us to money. In the Ministry for the Future, the plot, such as it was, revolved around the introduction of a carbon coin, which is to say, carbon quantitative easing. The kind of quantitative easing that we did in 2008 when the financial system collapsed from their own stupid real estate speculations, and then we bailed them out at cost to taxpayers, and then they went on doing the same thing. 2008 was massive, say $8 to $13 trillion given to the banks in order to recover from their own error. That could have been done differently. In 2020, during the pandemic, another massive tranche, trillions of dollars injected into the system, and this time given more to people than to banks, and saving small businesses and individuals from bankruptcy because of the pandemic shutdown. And that worked a little bit better. What it shows, those two incidences, is that money is a political invention. It is something that governments make to do what governments want to do. Fiat money is backed by the state and backed by the nation state systems and ultimately backed by armies as a certainty that your money's still going to be good down the line and people trust it. The more you look at money, the stranger it gets, of course. It's a medium of exchange, it's a storage of value, and it's a sign of social trust. When it's working, there is social trust. And since it is still working, there is some base level of social trust that you don't want to take for granted. And so what we could do now, and you can see it happening with the Inflation Reduction Act, which was a climate change act, about $380 billion with a lot of multiplier effects that were legislated into existence by the US Congress. That's not quantitative easing. That's simply legislative choices about where already existing money or money that the government is going to get in the future can be entrained to these green purposes. Quantitative easing would be the making up of new money from scratch by the central governments and backing it with their own fiat systems. But the first spending of that money would be on green causes, would be on decarbonization. And then it would enter the economy and into the general use of everybody. So that first spending of that money newly created being green, after that, it just becomes more money. It isn't at all obvious what that will do. Economists argue whether that will create inflation or deflation or nothing at all. The evidence is so mixed. Then we've seen good results from doing it in 2008 and in 2020, that there is really no good argument against carbon quantitative easing. And you can see the International Monetary Fund has a thing that they call special drawing rights. And special drawing rights is a mysterious bureaucratic name, partly to disguise what it is, which is the IMF has dispersed about $500 billion of loans that don't have to be repaid. So I'm thinking that that is, in fact, carbon quantitative easing. It's a little bit self-interested. Often the IMF gives special drawing rights to nations that owe money to the IMF. So it is somewhat like debt relief. It's new enough and strange enough that it needs to be investigated. I only bring it up because the carbon coin in my book is described with some specificity, but it is only one of many possible financial instruments that could be brought to bear to apply money at scale. It's going to cost trillions, and nobody wants to pay for it. No consumer wants to say, I want a sewage system for the sky. No individual can do it. The market system fails here. No individual government can afford to do it for the whole world. Although it's impressive to see efforts being made in China, in the US, in the EU, and to a small extent in India. One can easily imagine a consortium of central banks. And indeed, there's a group called the Network for Greening the Financial System. This is central banks that make that organization. There's about 90 of them. They're the biggest banks in the world. The ones you would want are there in a network for greening the financial system, workshopping methods for getting money out there to do green work immediately. And I think we're in a situation right now where really all of the big players are looking at each other going, who goes first? I personally am a miser. This is the institution or the country we're talking about. I personally am a miser on my hoard. I'm not going to do it, but if somebody else does it, I've got a lot of resources. If it's proven to work, I will put my money in. And private capital, the world of finance, the world of business, the world of monopoly, neoliberal, late capitalism has literally a couple few $100 trillion waiting to invest in things. And they have said to the governments of the world, if you would cover our risk, if we invest in something and lose it, if you will pay us back in full, then we'll take a little few points off of the rate of highest return. We'll actually give money to something that will save the world when it only returns us 6%, and we could have gotten 9% for destroying the world. Naturally, we're going to go for the 9% because we don't care about the world. We are capital. We go to the highest rate of return. And so governments, if you want us to invest in good things like saving the earth, you need to indemnify us. We need to be insured by government. Governments can say, okay, and a massive infusion of money can be poured into green work worldwide. And I would say we're in such a mixed economy, we're in such a desperate moment and such an inept system that deals like this ought to just be pursued all across the board like any other negotiation. Make it happen. Make the rate of highest return that green work is competitive and not much less profitable and as insured. And here the insurance industry, the reinsurance industry could help hugely by telling private capital, we're not even going to insure you for destroying the world anymore. Then you're not covered. Whereas if you do green work, you are going to be covered by government insurance. And that would shift a massive amount of investment capital. So, okay, enough about macroeconomics and political economy. I just want to end here because I'm really coming to the end of my time. And it's been interesting to try to quickly go through all of this. I want to say that in these next coming decades, there will be jobs, there will be careers, no matter what the majors are for those of you hearing this who are students at Stony Brook. There will be green work for that major. It will become the work of the next few decades. The generation that are students now, it's going to be their whole life. The problem will never go away. It will define the history of the middle of the 21st century. That's inescapable, unavoidable, and yet not automatically a bad thing for an individual citizen 20 years old living through these decades to come, living through to the year 2100. Work can be meaningful. It can be turned into a project that is world historical, saving the earth and saving the biosphere of the earth and getting in a good balance with the rest of the creatures on the earth is in fact good work, meaningful work, in a way that might not have existed during the high point of the neoliberal period, where fully 1/4 of the graduates of the fine private universities that are crowded around you in New England, north of you, 1/4 of those graduating classes went immediately to Wall Street to make money out of making money, out of manipulating money. And this was seen as the obvious thing to do for all too many people. That's meaningless work in a lot of ways. And people felt it. There was depression. There was nihilism. Well, now we have climate despair. It's a shift of a structure of feeling, but the notion that life is meaningless can quickly go away in a world where your efforts can be part of a generational effort. 80 years ago, the so-called greatest generation that were involved in the Depression and World War II, I mean, they gave themselves that name really, or one of their children did, but they did have a shared project that drew them together. And now I think it's even bigger than one powerful block of humanity pitted against another in a ferocious and pointless wars. Now it could be everybody working together. There will be resistance. There will be people who don't believe this version of events that I've just given to you, and they will have to be fought in an ongoing wicked political battle so that we can actually bring together the means to cope with the situation that we're in. That's undeniable. That's never going to go away also. The wicked political battle, the chance for meaningful work to get into a balance with the biosphere, they're both going to exist in spades in a standing contradiction that will feel quite lively, fraught, maybe a little desperate, like now. So I'm going to finish with that and call President McInnis back onto the stage with thanks to you all, and we'll have questions.
Thank you, Stan, both in the Ministry for the Future and just in that you've given us a lot to talk about and follow up on. And I know when I read the opening chapters of the Ministry for the Future, it was pretty bleak. It was a vision of what our future could be that felt very pessimistic. And while certainly all of you who've read the book know that, by the end, there's certainly some signs of hope, I still think many people might imagine that you wrote that with a fair degree of pessimism. And yet I've seen in a recent interview, you're saying you're feeling a little more optimistic than when you wrote the book. Prior to, 2019, I guess, when it was published. So I'd love to hear just a little bit more from you about what is giving you hope these days.
Sure. I want to clarify that when I wrote the first scene of Ministry for the Future, it was a horrible experience, I must say. I had to try to live it myself to write it effectively. And I was not feeling so much pessimistic as terrified. They're not the same. That wet bulb 35 event can happen. There was a wet bulb 35 temperature for an hour outside of Chicago, but of course, near the equator, it's becoming more and more common. We're trembling on the brink, as I said in my talk. So I was terrified, and I wrote it in 2019, and then the pandemic hit. And one of the things that makes me more hopeful now is the response to the pandemic on the whole was, especially in the sciences, extremely promising. And also everybody got a punch on the nose. So my first chapter is a kind of a punch on the nose, but it's extremely hypothetical compared to what the pandemic did to us. The pandemic slapped us in the face with the realization that the biosphere could kill us and change your life drastically. If not kill you, then change your life drastically on the turning of a dime. Well, I think that gave my book more force in people's minds when they read it. And then also, much more is happening now, and it's happening faster. Climate is being discussed as the present emergency that it is, in a way that wasn't true when I wrote the book. So my growing hopefulness is, I think that we're now up to speed. And now this is the obvious main problem in world history. And even the causes, the proximate, not the proximate cause, but the ultimate cause, the underlying cause of things like the wars that have broken out in this last year. Those are partly climate change inflected, a desperate search for resources, or a petrostate that knows that the main way that it's making money should go away. If it's not making money, then maybe it needs the breadbasket next door to feed its people. And at that point it invades. There are climate logics behind the wars that are going on, as well as old ethnic battles. So I would say that I am more optimistic in a pretty moderated sense. It comes down to this. We really are paying attention and trying to do things. And I've seen huge commitments by people all across the board, governments, diplomats, business people, academics, all of them focused on, can we deal with this problem? And that is a powerful combination of social forces. So I didn't think that was true when I wrote the book, and now I think it is true. So this is big.
Great, thank you for that. You've spoken and written about and demonstrated in Ministry of the Future and so many other places how climate change and the change we need is often intertwined with ethical dilemmas. Many of our students on campus are passionate about climate change, doing the right thing. They are those students you were just talking about who are going to be doing this work for the decades to come. They really want to do the work to ensure a more sustainable future. What advice do you have for them as they move forward with their studies and into their careers?
Well, I gestured at that in my talk. It doesn't matter what major they're in, and that's good because everybody's got their own skill set and their own desires. And I don't think something as strangely abstract and distant as climate change should be over-determining to the point where you can't follow your dream. You can follow your dream and it will lead you into green work inevitably by the way that the next couple decades are configuring. So I guess I would just say to any students, whatever you are interested in, you can find the green angle in it. And also all of us in the United States can reduce our carbon burn. And even though we're just 5% of the world population, we burn about 25% of the world's carbon. So our carbon savings are disproportionate to our numbers. This is an old statistic, and yet it probably still obtains entirely, that your ordinary American citizen is burning about 30 times as much carbon as an Indian farmer doing subsistence agriculture. So that's like 30 people's worth of hardworking people in the developing world that every American citizen is burning as much carbon as. Well, that can be cut back on. And what's interesting, I guess I would add this to any young people listening, is that does not reduce the pleasures of your lifestyle. It actually is an enhancement. That too much carbon being burned is like wearing a gigantic vest of crap, living in a cocoon of oil. It's a crappy lifestyle. The lifestyle I grew up in was in many ways stupid. And by burning less carbon, you can actually be more alive in the world. So this is not, oh, we partied and you have to suffer. It's more like we were stupid, you could be smart. And have more fun by burning less carbon and getting closer to the actual natural world. So this is what I try to say over and over again.
So, and these questions come from so many of our people in the audience who all submitted things beforehand. And we will never get to all of them because I have so many here in my lap. But a couple of people picked up on the concern for the longer term, and in many ways you were alluding to it, that Long Island is a precarious place, and with the passage of enough time, Long Island may not be here, and that is true for so much of the planet. But just more broadly, we have people who want to know, do you think humanity will survive the changes that are coming to this planet?
Oh, yes. I mean, this is one of those questions that, because the answer is obviously yes, it seems to be a ding on the severity of the crisis that we're in, or a challenge. Because you have to answer that yes. Humans are ingenious, and now we're very high tech. But let's put it this way, the civilization that we're in is unsustainable, which means it won't go on this way. And if we try to go on this way and wreck the biosphere and create that hothouse Earth situation, humanity won't go extinct, but civilization might crash. The difference is important to point out. There's 8 billion of us. If only 6 billion of us die, is that success? Because there's 2 more billion traumatized, post-traumatic, civilization wrecked, Dark Ages type, high tech but low morale civilization or post-civilization surviving that? That's failure enough. So the question is framed wrong. Humanity will survive. Civilization might not, or might be horribly crushed and have to come through a period that will always look for the humans that do survive, and you go farther out in the future, they'll look back and they will regret the exceptional stupidity of the 21st century humans who could have saved civilization and didn't. That will be the result. So extinction is for the other creatures, and there we have a crisis, a mass extinction event, the 6th great one in Earth's history. We've started it. We can maybe dodge it still, but that's the extinction event to talk about, not humanity surviving. Shift that question at all times and say, oh yeah, humanity will survive. You can tell the story, which apparently turns out not to be true. I loved it, that there was a big volcanic explosion 70,000 years ago, and in the DNA record, we can see that only about 3,000 humans were alive at the end of this volcanic nuclear winter, most of them on the coast of South Africa, living off of clams and a particular kind of plant that had a tuber. For 10 years in the dark, they survived, they repopulated the planet. More evidence is appearing that makes that story look like perhaps not what really happened. It was a devastating event, but people did quite well. Even with the technology of 73,000 years ago, humans survived a devastating climactic event. So we will survive, but we're also very brittle, fragile. We're like at the top of a tower of Babel, a tower of prostheses that we built ourselves that we could crash by inattention, at which point there'll be again these few people getting by for a few generations and then pulling themselves back together. It's the only way. This is sort of a sets of competing science fiction stories, but you need to resist the ones that are simplistic and apocalyptic. Oh my God, we're doomed. Oh my God, we might kill off everybody. There's not hardly anything that could happen that can kill off everybody on the planet. A massive asteroid impact, yes, that would kill a lot of people. It wouldn't kill off everybody. And it goes on like that. Even a full nuclear exchange, that might kill everybody, yes, like on the beach, just because of radiation. But aside from that, it's not humanity that's in danger of going extinct. It's a humanity in danger of wrecking their biosphere and creating a mass catastrophe.
So you lay out in Ministry for the Future a number of the changes of the ways that we could be living in the future that are some of those changes we need to be making, those changes that we would look back and say, you idiots, why didn't you do this? So whether that is airships instead of airplanes, or whether that is rewilding the planet, or carbon quantitative easing, you put forth a number of things. I'm curious, first, what are the things you think this audience listening to you today, what are the changes they need to be making today to make a difference?
Oh dear. Well, I guess I would say first that A, everybody knows the answers to this question already, and B, I don't like to tell other people what to do. I myself am still flying to Europe if I feel that I might have an impact such that it would be carbon negative for me to do so. That might be fooling myself. I love going over there. And I am going to take a sailing ship voyage for the first time in my life because it seems to me that that would be a low carbon burn way to get the pleasures of travel, which are very real. And so I don't want to, we all in our way can, you can easily calculate your carbon burn, either instinctively or quantitatively. That's not a problem. You can see places where you can lower your carbon burn without impacting your pleasure and maybe even increasing the pleasure in your own, the sophistication of your own technology and your habits. So one can review that and do things. I think a lot of people already are. And I guess I would leave it at that. The only other thing is, oh yes, everywhere, and no matter what size town you're in, there is a climate action group doing things. You can join the local efforts. I joined Cool Davis when I came back from COP26. Such a pleasure to do something tangible in one's own town. You can do that. And then, of course, you have to vote for the politicians that A, are advocating climate action, and B, are not following the line of their funders in the fossil fuel industry. So your political action matters, your local activist action matters. Essentially, we're in a kind of polyarchy. One of the strengths, supposedly, and I think it's quite real, of democratic societies is civil society, the encouragement of being in all kinds of action groups that have different amounts of power in the creation of the civilization. And so whatever opportunities you see, it's more interesting than watching TV that night. And I want to encourage people to think that there are things that are both boring and interesting at the same time, like city council meetings, like church, like almost anything that is officious, local, and slow is boring and yet more interesting than watching TV. So you have to think of it as like bad live theater, to go down and support it and take part in it.
So you touched on many of the technological solutions and innovations that might be possible for us going forward, some of it in the geoengineering space, some of it in other spaces, the work around glaciers and so forth. A couple of topics that I think people would be interested in hearing you speak about that both are very relevant to livelihoods on Long Island. One is around transportation. Long Island is essentially an island of suburbs, and people move very long distances quite often in order to get to their place of work or other things they're doing in their life. And Long Island is a place with a lot of agriculture. And we know what a significant impact current agricultural practices have in terms of a carbon footprint. So I wonder if you could, and we had questions about both of those, if you could speak to both of those topics.
Yes, yes. Although I'm going to be brief because I believe everybody listening knows this stuff already. Although I'll linger on regenerative agriculture. Transport, it'd be better if we could electrify it and minimize it. But in America, we have big distances and a habit of travel. Electrify, that's probably step number one, and then see if you can reduce your transport times, not just individually, but in civic senses of trying to centralize. It's an ongoing project that has to do with the reimagining cities. And indeed, it's funny that you say Long Island is an island of suburbs, because I come from Orange County, California, a gigantic coastal plain of suburbs, and suburbs are not well done. Small towns are well done, big cities are well done, suburbs are poorly done when it comes to carbon burn and when it comes to social life. The isolation of pretending that your quarter-acre individual home with your nuclear family is the height of success, when people jammed into apartment complexes have a richer social life if it's constructed right. As a child of suburbia, I'm going to say it was a mistake in construction and social engineering. And so but that can be rebuilt. It might be a 100-year project, it might be a 200-year project, but redoing suburbia is an American problem by and large. And then the regenerative agriculture is a great word and it's an interesting project. Could we draw carbon down into the soil at the same time we were growing food? If we could, that would be fantastic. And it's not impossible, but it's not easy, and there are limits to how much carbon you can draw down into any particular field of soil before you begin to max out on how much carbon that particular soil field can hold. These are technical questions in the technology called agriculture. And any ag division worth its salt, and I'm thinking in particular of UC, University of California, Davis, my town, not my school, and they invented the Green Revolution along with Cornell and a couple of other big ag schools. And the Green Revolution fed a lot of people by using fossil fuels for pesticides, for fertilizers, and for running the tractors in the first place, just burning fossil fuels, left, right, and center. To decarbonize agriculture and to draw carbon down into the soil, that requires an agricultural revolution equal to the Green Revolution. And but universities are now being mostly funded by big corporate agriculture. So the very academic and experimental institutions that might be figuring out how to do this are also in the pocket of their donors, because the legislators of America in both New York and in California and elsewhere, I'm sure, have defunded their public universities, so that universities that used to be funded by legislatures and by the people, being people's universities for both students, teachers, and the public, were privatized in the neoliberal years, so that the funding of many public universities went from 80% of their funds to 8% of their funds. And suddenly they're begging for cash just like any private university, but with less understanding by people that it's donations and sales of their intellectual work that keep the universities going, not student fees. So inventing regenerative agriculture would require also the recovery of public education. The privatization of the neoliberal era was a catastrophe. Public should have owned these things, not private individuals for profit. So it is systemic, and yet it's pursuable. Once you understand the nature of the problem, you can begin to support public universities like we used to. You can begin to demand that your agricultural departments research regenerative agriculture rather than fine-tuning the Green Revolution destructive agriculture, and push it from there. So again, these are systemic and not easy fixes, but they're particularly regenerative agriculture is extremely promising as a method.
Thank you. And we're nearing the end of our time, so I'm going to ask you to opine a bit on the following. Much of what you write about, much of what our faculty and students who are working on issues related to climate change and climate science and climate solutions, much of it's been known for a very long time. And yet we have struggled to get people to change their behaviors. We have struggled to get them to see the problem that is in front of them. And I know that much of your writing certainly hopes to bring a lot of these issues to people's attention. As I mentioned in the opening remarks, and I hope I think we've shared with you as well, we were selected last year by the City of New York and the Trust for Governors Island to create this new partnership that we're calling the New York Climate Exchange. And in it, we are bringing together a group of American and international universities. We are bringing together dozens of community-based action groups and environmental justice groups, and we are working alongside businesses not that are funding agriculture or not that are themselves, petro companies. They are instead the companies, though, that are interested maybe in commercializing technology and innovation that we create for a green economy. Or they are Moody's, who are interested in the ways in which weather is changing insurance risk profiles and so forth. So what do you think? We would love to hear your ideas. What are the possibilities for a partnership like this helping to intervene in both the space of making solutions, but also helping to bring these issues to light and maybe encouraging more change?
Well, it's an exciting project. Governor's Island is well positioned to as a teaching device. You can have what Brecht called a Lehrenstücke, a teaching piece on the island itself. I would immediately draw in a band of red paint across the island, a horizontal band of sea level, where sea level would be. In my New York 2140, a novel from 2016, I had sea level rise by about 50 feet by the year 2140. That's extreme, but not impossible. And so if you had a red line there, if you had 3D models like somewhere in Queens near Shea Stadium is a model of New York City area on a miniature scale where you can look down on the city with all of its buildings. Spectacular, amazing. Make one of those and then fill it with water up to 20 feet higher water level. And you would have what I called the super Venice. And you would also show how areas of uptown New York, around Columbia and up there at the cloisters, are very much higher than lower Manhattan. You could play the game of the New York harbor. Exceptionally fine, beautiful harbor in both natural and human terms, a world masterpiece of a harbor. And there you are on Governor's Island in the middle of it, looking around. You could indicate what climate change could do to wreck it. And even though there's adaptations, even though humans would still come to that harbor and scramble for a livelihood like they do now, nevertheless, it would be so changed as to be shocking. And then, since you're gathering people from all different parts of life, you could indeed try to make combinations that show that there's livelihoods to be made doing climate mitigation work, that it's going to take polyarchy and a mixture of kinds of economic systems. I would look to a recent article in the London Review of Books about the way things are working now in China at the city level. I think it's called the mayor economy, because mayors of various Chinese cities at different levels, and they get official rankings in the Chinese system. They can make huge differences by public-private combinations that defy our older understandings of, let's say, capitalism and socialism. And maybe, although those are useful terms in a kind of broad historical or philosophical or at the largest levels of analysis, in terms of the reality of right now, the mixtures are so extreme that those old names might not describe what we're doing, that there might be public-private combinations that are possible, and especially at the local and at the regional scale, that the nation states with their insane insistence on sovereignty and the largest sources of capital on the planet with their insane miserliness of their hoard, like we can't give our money away, we have to give it to the highest rate of return. All that begins to break down when you have possibilities of making a livelihood by doing something that combines public and private. So, I mean, I recommend that article for being kind of a mind boggler of a different human system that is nevertheless doing quite well in ways that are underreported in the West. And to be imaginative about it. It's a kind of a science fiction exercise that you'll be doing there on Governor's Island, and that you're going to be looking out 50 years and saying, well, it could be like this. So you might as well do utopian science fiction once you're given that assignment, because the dystopias are too obvious and they're painfully boring and repetitive. You can only watch so many zombie shows before you get sick of it. And you are interested in, well, how can we actually do better without guns and without the threat of people eating our brains? So utopian science fiction is really the point. And I want you to think of your Governor's Island project as being an exercise in utopian science fiction.
Well, thank you for that. I hope one day, once our campus is open, that we can welcome you off of your sailing ship in New York Harbor onto Governor's Island to see our utopian living laboratory of what the future could be like. Thank you to all the members of the audience who can be here, and a big round of applause for Stan Robinson. Thank you so much. Have a good evening.